change for non-change managers. Tell me a little bit about that and what inspired you to create it.
What inspired me to create that was our clients, our organizations. And in fact, they were the ones that named it. I run quarterly sessions with directors of change and transformation or heads of change and transformation from around the world. And we look at the latest trends and what their needs are. And one of the overwhelming needs, based on the volume of change that's happening, and there was an IBM survey recently that talked about 63% of CEOs want to increase the tempo, increase the pace of transformation in their organizations. And bearing in mind the change capability survey says that only 4 in 10 people feel that they've got the time to cope with the change they have now. There's obviously this sort of disconnect. And I think Professor John Cotter talks about building a volunteer army of people who can lead themselves confidently and cope with the pressures of change. How are we delivering that? How are we upskilling people who do not see themselves as change professionals? They are the heads of marketing or finance. They are operational managers. They're out in the field. They're servicing customers. And yet at the same time, they also have this amazing pressure on them to lead their teams and themselves from existing to new ways of working. How do we build that skill as easily as possible across a huge number of people within an organization? It simply is not possible to pull out all of those people onto large scale formal training programs. People don't have the time and they don't have the budget. But having that skill and being able to cope is what our client organizations are telling us they need desperately. And conversation that I've had with so many of them, and that's why the title is Change for Non-Change Managers, is so many of the learning and development professionals and change and transformation professionals that I have talked to have all referenced this one training course, which is called Finance for Non-Finance Managers. And they've said, if you get up into middle and senior management positions in an organization, you cannot rise into those positions without some understanding of budgeting and forecasting and managing money. So you have finance for non-finance managers because you're not going to be a finance professional, but you need some understanding. Why haven't we got this understanding of change and transformation? It's the same thing. And so I've used the title that has been referenced the most by organizations saying, this is what we want from you. And I have a whole list of people who are waiting for me to release this new masterclass, Change for Non-Change Managers, out onto Changeability Pro because they're members of Changeability Pro and they want to put their managers onto this particular masterclass.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you were talking about that, it just felt like a huge topic area. And so, how did you then structure that into a 5 hour format just to create that engagement with people?
I've started with empathy. I'll be honest, I started the wrong way to begin with because I started sort of listing out all the things I know about change management and thinking, how could I pass that on? And realized, no, you've missed the point, Melanie. Go back to the original brief. These are non change managers. So I've gone back with empathy and thought, actually, what is it you need to know if you have a full time day job? You might be the customer services manager or a supervisor in a customer services team. You might be in a marketing team that's moving to a new CRM system. And the whole responsibility for sort of making that change happen for yourself and people around you has sort of landed on you. How does that feel? What do you need? You need the answers as quickly as possible. You definitely don't need a whole theoretical lecture on what is change management? How does change management work? I've done a little bit on what is change to make sure we're all talking about the same thing in the first session within the first module. But after that, it's very practical. It's saying, okay, how do you take part in scoping the change? And I've been very empathetic because actually managers at this level are more takers than makers of change. What happens is that further up in their organization, a change has been decided and commissioned. At some point, they become involved long after the scope has been fixed. And yet, these managers are then pointing out micro level changes, impacts that will happen within their team or their department that perhaps were not considered at that higher strategic level. So every time I've looked at something, whether it's scoping and having those conversations, or whether it's creating a plan for the change, not some big formal change management plan, but a plan of it. Do you know how to organize your time to create enough space for you to think about the impact of the change, for you to create your own messages about the change to your team, for you to plan how people are going to get the time to take part in change, which resources from your existing team you should involve in the change. I've looked every time from the perspective of that manager is not a change expert. They just want the practical steps that will get them there.
And you talked a lot there about practical steps, but how did you balance that practical with the theory?
To be honest, I've almost ignored a lot of the theoretical models because when we've trialed this with people, they're not really interested. And I think more to the point, there's a danger. If I start talking about the theories and models associated with change, it creates the impression that this is some kind of art form. This is some extra level that you have to learn. There's a whole new skill set. And these are people that are already incredibly busy with their business as usual. And they know that on top of that, they've got to start peeling away layers of what's currently done within their team and shifting that to new ways of doing things, making use of new systems, new processes, new organization structures. So, do they really want to learn all of this theory or do they just want the answers?
Mm,
Right. When it comes to getting together a group of people who are going to redesign your processes, these are some of the things to consider.
yeah, and
That's what they need.
and I know I've probably asked you this before in a previous interview, but what about your perspectives around the non-change manager? What are your perspectives and expertise that you bring to this that you feel sets this masterclass apart from anybody else that's talking change to non-change managers?
I think it's probably the huge volume of changes that I have led and the number of managers that I have coached. I've spent years building effective and rapid uh, relationships with managers who are about to lead their team through change. And I have had the experience sat at the side of their desk of what they don't want to hear about. And when you can see their eyes glaze over and they haven't got the patience to hear about it versus the things that they do want to hear from me. And so I've always maximized what those things are, which is answers. Well, how do I do that? What if my team are going to get angry about this? Or we're so busy with this deadline for customers, how am I still going to keep the change on track? So I'm so used to every practical question they ask me that I'm just making sure that I'm giving them the answers and the things that are most impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you kind of did prepare for this, what were the lessons and insights you got from researching and preparing for this masterclass?
Again, I keep coming back to that. It's getting the perspective right, it's getting the empathy right, and actually walking in the shoes of those who already have a very busy operational or business as usual role and what their perspective is. And to keep it simple, to recognize that change can often be seen as a disruption, a distraction, an annoyance, actually. Particularly as many of their performance metrics for themselves, but also for their team members, are centered on current delivery. How many customer transactions are we processing? How many customer queries are we answering? How much revenue are we bringing forward? None of that relates to actually getting the change done. So I think it's that perspective of keeping change as painless as possible while still balancing the business as usual. I've got to focus on that and finding the time to actually make change happen at the same time.
Yeah. And what about the impact on the people who are going to be watching this? What do you think that the impact might be, or what do you hope that the impact might be?
I think what I want to do is take stress out of the workplace. What I want to do is build people's confidence that the things they're being expected to do, and this was another big conversation with many of the clients who've asked for the Change for Non-Change Managers masterclass, which is that increasingly the proportion of a manager's day is spent being pulled into so many conversations about so many changes that are happening. So they finding their meeting schedule about advising on the scope, having to pull together their own plan of change, encouraging and coaching and listening to their own team members as they make that transition, that almost the proportion of what they're doing versus the proportion of keeping the day job going and the existing processes is shifting. And we talked a lot about the proportion of time that managers spend managing change. And yet, there's nothing in their organization's leadership development programs of this practical nature. So I think it's, don't worry, we've got an approach for you. It's relatively painless. It takes into account the pressures you're under. Here are practical solutions, ideas, techniques, advice, tried and tested by people who've been there and been doing this for years. So this just gives you an immediate set of answers, an immediate set of solutions, which I really hope will take some of the stress away from what appears to be an ever more stressful working life.
Yeah, and as we're talking today, this is about to be launched. When we do launch it, I know you'll have tested this out on quite a few people. So the audience you've tested these ideas on, have you had any surprising or memorable feedback?
I think the most memorable feedback at the moment is the appetite for this and the feeling that this should have been done years ago. Really, really pleased that the content is targeted to with empathy
Hmm.
towards those who do not want to build a career in change. They want practical answers without knowing all the background. They don't want to study for change management qualifications or read textbooks on how to make change happen. It's part of their role. They just want some help in getting it done.
Yeah, and this sounds really, really exciting. So, if somebody just took one thing away from that masterclass, what's it going to be? What's that one thing?
Um, I think it is about, as a manager, really understanding the journey you're about to take your team on and understanding what those steps are, what the likely reactions are, what the time involved is likely to be. This masterclass effectively gives you a way of planning your own route through it, of creating your own timeline, but also thinking about how you look at your existing workload and what you have to do to create that space to be the change manager, albeit at that your local level, but you have to take on that role. You're probably not getting paid extra for it. It might not be called out in your performance reviews, but you do have to do it. There's an underlying expectation. And I think giving you a route to being able to do that and surfacing what's involved and explaining it in a step-by-step way is probably the most important thing.
Brilliant. And I think I've covered all of the topics. I just want one sort of final question, and that we've talked before about looking ahead and the future, but looking ahead for non-change managers, is there anything there that you think you want to pull out that's like key for the future?
I think for their own protection, I think once they take this masterclass, it's perhaps that recognition of how much of their time and energy is spent in leading themselves and their teams through change and questioning whether or not that is really reflected in their role description and is therefore it really reflected in their performance management of their own role. Are they being recognized for the efforts that they're putting in? I think it all starts with the role description. And I think it's something that is a very useful conversation to raise in any annual appraisal, and also questions to ask about the implied expectation of managing change whenever they change roles.
That's great. Thank you for this interview today.
Pleasure.